Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the HCMG State of Human Capital Management in Government, sponsored by Cornerstone. My name is Andrew Greisman, WBR Insights Senior Analyst for HCMG, and I'll be moderating this presentation. Before we dive in, I'd like to bring your attention to the console in front of you. The windows or widgets laid out on the screen are customizable, meaning you can move these around to maximize, minimize, or reposition them to fit whatever device you're using to connect with us. Please refer to the Resource Center to download the newly published benchmark report that our presentation is based off of. And we're going to try to save 15 minutes or so at the end of today's discussion for a Q&A session. So at any point during the discussion, feel free to submit questions using that specific portal. Lastly, we have a few polls set up throughout today's webinar, so once they appear on your screen, simply click your response and hit submit. We'll tally up the results. On that note, let's meet our panelists. We have with us today Aaron Lee, who's the Director of Leadership and Professional Development at the Veterans Benefits Administration. So please say hey to everybody. Thank you, Aaron.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Camille M. Hoover, who's the Executive Officer at the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases at the National Institute of Health.
Good afternoon, everyone.
We have with us Jim Egbert, who's the Human Capital Strategist at the Department of Health and Human Services.
Hello, everyone.
Steve Dabrowski, who's the Principal Consultant at Cornerstone OnDemand.
Hi, everyone, and well done on that last name, Andrew. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And again, I'm Andrew Greisman, the WBR Insights Senior Analyst for HCMG. So before we get into our panel presentation, let's set the stage. I want to introduce the research project that this presentation is based on. For the 5th year in a row, HCMG and Cornerstone reached out to members of our communities to learn about the challenges facing government human capital managers. In 2018, we see some new twists on old trends. Culture is still a commonly cited barrier, and this year was no different. The majority of respondents felt that this was a barrier to come with many of the changes they want to make, something that is long-standing and a special consideration that they have to work around. That said, technology is now an area that leaders are looking at more as a way around this and other challenges, specifically getting the tools to gather more data on performance and developing analytics to measure success in areas for improvement. Lastly, we found for the first time since we've begun this series that succession planning has overtaken leadership development as the top priority for our respondents, suggesting that the need to fill positions is becoming more urgent for many agencies. So let's take a look at our data and get our panel's opinions on this idea of fair and effective succession planning. I'd like to ask you, Aaron, how can the organization develop lines of succession while providing advancement and learning opportunities across the full workforce?
So one of the things I think that all organizations can do across the spectrum is to look at creating customizable succession plans for different grade and job series of employees. I think one of the challenges and one of the defaults that we have in our general business areas is that we look at succession planning in a large scope, massive project, when we really have to think that the individual themselves have their own devices and ways that they want to be matured and grown throughout the organization. So I think first starting with those individuals and finding out exactly what succession looks like to them will really help organizations to look at it in a more grander scale. Camille, what are you guys doing?
So, at NIH and specifically at NIDDK, what I think is paramount is creating a culture that integrates training, learning, prioritizes the developmental opportunities for all the staff. And when you're pushing staff to go out of their comfort zone, you're simultaneously developing the full workforce, and you are in that same platform identifying who are those star employees that are rising to the occasion from creating such an environment. And I think that if you, as a leader, articulate your vision and very clearly state your core values, such as excellence, integrity, collaboration, or diversity, and then you have ambassadors, your right hands, that are out on the front lines with folks, emulating those core values, translating that vision, and then helping people within that larger culture be able to grow, learn, take risks, try out new things and develop as employees, you actually create your succession plan at all the different tiers, from the most junior staff that can move up to the journeyman level, the journeyman that then can become the leads, and then the leads that will transition into the more senior leaders. So that's something that's really important, I think, as part of the philosophy. So that's my thoughts on things.
So this is Jim at HHS. We have 12 major divisions, such as the FDA, the CDC, National Institutes of Health, and 9 others, and they all work together to achieve the mission of HHS in protecting and promoting the health of all Americans. One of the ways that we seek to develop lines of succession is through the collaboration work done through various enterprise workforce councils, such as the Learning Council, chaired by our Enterprise Chief Learning Officer, in addition to other councils, such as the Workforce Planning Council and our Leadership Development Council that we have in place, and each one of those has representation from each of our major components. I think together these collaborative bodies help to promote best practice sharing and also resource development to ensure that we have a talent pipeline needed for the 21st century workforce.
So those are all really great points. This is Steve Dombrowski, and I wanted to do just by way of introduction, I work for Cornerstone OnDemand, but my history includes experiences at the Treasury Department and also head of leadership and learning for the Internal Revenue Service. So this is something that really stuck out for me in this report, and we've done this report, as Andrew mentioned, now 5 years in a row. And we always thought that succession planning was going to become more and more important, and we're going to see that in these surveys. And this is really the first year that we're seeing it. And I've been in front of a lot of different HR and training and development folks, both in federal, state, and local governments, and even in universities, where we've talked about this silver tsunami that was coming. And it feels like this is in reaction to that idea that now really there is a big need for succession planning. In previous years, what I think agencies did was they shied away from this notion of succession planning because there's this big no-no in government called pre-selection. So they stayed away from that idea of succession planning to completely avoid the appearance or thought of pre-selecting someone for an individual position. But I think what the survey actually shows this year is organizations at every level are actually finally understanding the importance and the need and the technicalities of how to do succession planning effectively, right? It's all about developing talent pools, different levels of leaders, and not this notion of pre-selection, but it's really focused in on developing them. The other thing I will say, and then I'll toss it to Andrew, is whatever sort of succession planning each of you guys do, and I heard, NIH, HHS, and Veterans Administration, what's really critical is that whatever you do, that it's transparent and that everyone knows it. So there isn't this myth or secret thing that you're doing as an organization. It's very transparent, it's very clear. So yeah, I thought this was really interesting this year.
Thanks, Steve. Actually, now is the time for our first live poll. So you in the audience can also contribute and let us know, where do you feel the greatest need for development in your organizations? So here you see our responses on screen. Please take a couple seconds to just click the one you think is the most appropriate, and then in a few moments we'll look at the results. We have succession planning, continuous learning and development, use of technology systems and applications, and leadership development. So again, we'll take just a couple more seconds, and then we'll see how you all respond. Okay, let's see our results. And again, we see succession planning coming in with a third of the respondents, and the other half looking like continuous learning and development with an outlier of leadership development. So Steve, if you could just briefly comment, do you feel like this is surprising before we move on to our next data findings?
So no, I don't think it's surprising. I actually think this is kind of all related, right? So all of the choices are related. The continuous learning and development, we know that learning and development in today's world has to be continual, right? The job that you got hired for is probably not the job you're going to be doing in the next 5-6 years. We're in a skills economy where you actually need to develop skills, and so that continuous development is becoming critical. I also think that feeds into succession planning and leadership development. And how do you do that? You do it through the use of technology and application. So I think all of these are related, so it wasn't a surprise for me on this one.
Mm-hmm. All right, our next topic that we're going to be looking at is building engagement with limited resources. So this is, of course, a central challenge for HR management, and we see that there are several different ways that people are approaching this. Teleworking remains very popular, along with non-monetary recognition or awards, as well as work-life programs. In the next year, we'll see more job rotations, as well as plans to increase training and offer mentorships. So I want to ask you, Camille, what can HCM leaders prioritize in order to deliver the most engagement possible?
Thanks, Andrew, for the question. What I would say in this area is leaders are spending a lot of time, energy, thought, and resources on many different engagement activities. And what is the top priority for me and for NIDDK is to make sure that when we are doing this, we are including the voice of the people. And we do that through several different venues, through town hall meetings, through having roundtables with staff, focus groups. You know, the employee viewpoint survey that OPM sent out every year is a critical piece of data in helping us to understand what we're doing right, where we can improve, what our best practices are. So based on that, we try to create targeted, focused, strategic initiatives that are going to speak to where the engagement is most needed. And then part of what we always do is make sure that the staff understand that you spoke, we listened, this happened. So we are, whatever the activities are, be it workshops, be it meaningful recognition, that's more in line with what our employees want. We are always trying to make sure that we tie it back so that the employees of the organization know that they had a voice and that they help to affect change. One last thing I'll say about this, the other thing we do at NIDDK is to try to make sure we are always tying the work of the employees to the mission of the organization, so that no matter if they're an administrator, no matter if they're a budget person or a tech in the lab, that they understand that they have a significant contribution to make, and that because of their efforts, we are successful with our scientific mission. Aaron, can I pass it on to you for your thoughts?
Sure. I think one of the greatest things that we can do is to look again at what the individual employees and learners, what platforms are better utilized for them for engagement. I think that we have a tendency to paint a broad stroke and just assume that everyone will probably get something out of this face-to-face engagement, or everyone will get something out of this virtual engagement, and not really looking at the individual needs of the learners or the employees. So I think that's really one of the greatest areas of need that we have, is identifying those varying platforms as to how people receive information. So that way, when we want to really test and measure the engagement, we're measuring it based off of that particular person's way that they best receive information, as opposed to measuring it against what we think they need to see. And so I think once we get there, and there's so many different platforms that are available now to us that are very dynamic in nature. We use Blue Jean. There is also Adobe Connect. So many different platforms now where we can really test these different measures out that aren't very expensive, that we can really do a better job of communicating with employees and increasing their individualized level of engagement. What are you guys doing over there, James?
Well, here at HHS, we focus on both the workforce conditions for engagement and the actual experience of engagement of the employees. In terms of the conditions for engagement, you might have seen that HHS moved up from 5th place to best places to work to 2nd place for large agencies in the annual 2017 rankings from the Partnership for Public Service. These rankings are based on results from the annual Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, specifically 3 questions in the FEVS: that employees recommend their organization a good place to work, that they're satisfied with their job, they're satisfied with the organization. For the past several years, HHS has noticed that, in large part what leaders do is they help to focus attention on areas needing adjustment and then clarify intention around how to best achieve these needed outcomes. And here at HHS, from the highest levels of HHS leadership, we focused on 5 FEVS performance factors: participation rate in the annual survey, global satisfaction, employee engagement, effective communication using our HHS Effective Communication Index, and belief in action that something will be done in the organization to use the results. As Camille said, you spoke, we listened, and this happened. So that belief in action is critically important. And each year we initially set a 70% positive response for each one of these areas, and then each year we incrementally raise that bar and set the standard for going forward.
So I think that's fascinating. This is Steve. I just want to drive down something on this point in particular, and I know the question asked about organizations. One thing I don't want to lose sight of is each of you, probably on the webinar, and I know on the panel, are leaders at your organizations. So it's not just tied, this concept of engagement with limited resources is not just tied to what you as an organization are doing, it's what you as an individual leader is doing, right? So I think it's important to be cognizant of that. And there are a couple things that I think are critical when we talk about individual leader fostering engagement. One is authenticity. Be real on the job and let people see you, who you are in your leadership style. Be transparent and be authentic. And then the other thing I would say is we have a lot of federal employees on this webinar. So the important thing and things that are going on in the federal government are making sure that we're inclusive of everyone and everywhere, right? So at IRS, for example, I had a staff of about 30 or so people, some of whom I worked there for over 2 years and it didn't meet face-to-face, right? So you have to find ways to overcome the obstacles that are out there and make people feel like they're part of a team, part of a cause, and that their work actually makes a difference. So Andrew, sorry, I'll toss it back to you.
No problem. Thanks, Steve. So the next topic that I'd like to speak on is developing a modern approach to training and development. This really touches on the technology piece that was a focus of this year's research in particular. So we're seeing some areas where people are prioritizing or telling us how developed their analytics currently are. And as predicted, it's mostly in a middling range here. But what I wanted to ask to our panelists, and I will ask to you specifically, James, first, what are some of the benefits that come from building an approach to talent management supported by better analytics? And perhaps you have some best practices for how you could go about setting those up or in action, things of that nature.
Well, absolutely. So better analytics and talent management allows organizations to have a deeper data-supported view of the entire spectrum of the employee lifecycle. Providing human capital leaders with timely, meaningful, and accurate data sets allows for better recruiting and staffing, engagement and development, performance management awards, and transition of workforce elements as dictated by mission requirements. Just one area of importance to the federal government is the focus we have across the agencies with regard to mission-critical occupations. This focus on mission-critical occupations makes for a good example of better analytics opportunities, helping organizations recruit, develop, and retain the needed talent to meet the mission. With a useful competency model, for example, we can better identify organizational needs in meeting the mission in both numbers of, say, medical officers that we need, sort of the slots that we need, in addition to the level of competency that's needed to operate successfully in each one of these mission occupations. So that's a little bit about what we're doing with the data here at HHS. Camille, you want to tell us a little bit about the NIH?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jim. So when I think about the need for outstanding analytics, I think it's really imperative that we have that in order to make the most use of our resources and our time and our energy. And I can take the Employee Viewpoint Survey as a perfect example. OPM has created this survey. It has got a wealth of information for leaders on where we're doing well, where we could improve, what the people of the organization think about the agency, the leadership, and it is quite robust. At NIDDK, we have actually created a tool called EVS Art that is an extraordinary tool created by my colleague Robin Clevens and VTran, And it has been able to take this wealth of information that normally, though, takes federal agencies weeks or months to sort through and sift and decide what they want to focus on. And now with this tool, within a matter of minutes, you have a full analytics with heat maps and dashboards and the deep dive of what the people of the organization think. And why this is so important is because it has the proverbial snowball effect. When you have an expedited analysis of what the people of the organization need and think and want, you can, as a leader, make much more timely decision-making about the data and about what you want to create as targeted strategic initiatives, be it on the need to have more meaningful recognition to make sure your employees get constructive feedback about where they are and expectations for improvement, their satisfaction with their jobs, their satisfaction with their career development. There's just a wealth that you can target your strategic initiatives on. And if you're targeting them and you're hitting what the people of the organization want, you're going to have increased engagement. You're going to have better stewardship of your resources, especially limited, which in effect will lead to improved morale, improved performance, which ultimately leads to improved service for the American public. And that's really what this is all about, no matter what agency you come from. So just a little plug about EVS ART. We are gifting it to any of our sister federal agencies that would like to use it. We've been out and about, and it's really a useful tool so that you can take an analytic EVS that we have now and be able to use it in a much more profound and powerful way. And with that, I will turn it over to Aaron.
Well, thanks so much, Camille. So my colleagues have given some really great detailed data on the tools and analytics to that regard. And I'll go kind of even to a more basic level. And what I've seen across agencies where people really struggle is where do the analytics live? And I think one of the challenges that we've had is HR has just become kind of the dumping ground for things that seem to be people-focused, but we really don't necessarily know what to do with that analysis. And I think agencies and other organizations do this well when they actually have a dedicated staff that have that background to look at business intelligence. Because if you don't have the understanding of what BI is, then it's really hard to extrapolate the data and give it to those people who really can use it. And so when we're working with, and how this ties back to succession planning and also in individualized employee engagement, we really want to make sure that it's housed in a place where there are people who really know how data works and then how to segregate that data in ways that are palatable to the audience. So my advice has always been make sure that you have a dedicated group of people or persons who really understand that data, and then that they have a clear understanding of the audience who's going to be utilizing that data, so that way that data is not just static and it's actually something dynamic that can be utilized throughout the organization. Steve, what about you?
So all very great comments. I think here in analytics, when we start talking about this and how analytics are coming into HR, I want to pause just for a second about maybe future. What I really want to talk about initially is where have we been with HR analytics and data, right? So when we sit down with the head of the organization, what are some of the things that we're reporting? We're reporting on percent of people completing mandatory training, or percent of people participating in various leadership programs, or we're talking about time to hire, how many days did it take to do this, right? It's all stuff that, while important, it's historical, and it doesn't take into consideration in terms of what we should be doing in the future. It doesn't take bits of data that we have at our fingertips and use that to start to forecast and predict future behavior. You know, basic business organizations call it this sitting at the C level, right? So for government, it might be at the leadership with your head of your organization, but HR now has a seat at that table. And so what we do with that seat is going to become important, because if we start using the data sets that we actually have to start forecasting, for example, where should we be recruiting? Those types of people that we actually bring in that have X, Y, and Z competencies are a lot more successful in our organizations. Those people that are identified as high potentials in our organization have taken, you know, this training, and this training. So therefore, we should be recommending those types of trainings and those competencies for others, you know, or even back down to the mandatory training. People, if we make the due date on this training, mandatory IT security training on Friday, they're a lot more likely to complete it, right? So we're going to be a lot more successful. The data's out there. The technology's out there now where we can actually start to use that information to do it. The data's always been there. We just haven't been able to use it and plug it in, right? So start applying that to the succession planning, start applying that to skill gap plugging, those types of things that we can now start forecasting instead of looking in the rearview mirror and reporting about what actually happened. Let's start talking about what possibly could happen based on some sort of data set. So I think it's a really exciting time to start seeing this spin on analytics coming into HR and how it's having impact on, you know, talent management, but also employee engagement and job satisfaction, right? So I think in the government, we're having talent drain, so we have to do everything we can possibly do to attract and retain the folks that are actually coming in and making the decision to stay here. Because we know that as soon as individuals come into an organization, they're making a decision whether or not they're going to stay. So Andrew, I'll toss it to you for our next topic.
Thanks, Steve. So I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about this technology piece because, again, it's been a big focus of our research. And essentially what I would like to ask is, you know, how are people dealing with change as they roll out these new tools? You know, what are some of the ways that they're able to facilitate this new approach as we develop, you know, understand from our research, culture can be a big barrier to change. So basically, I'd like to have us go around the horn one more time and just clarify, you know, what are some methods for introducing these new tools and methods? So James, do you have any opinions or strategies for, you know, introducing the idea of the importance of analytics within your own experience?
Well, thank you. For the past few years, I've been involved with the Office of Personnel Management and working with other agencies across the federal government, and an activity that's called HR Stat. And HR Stat really is around this idea that putting key metrics for HR metrics, workforce metrics, in front of the senior leader of the organization, perhaps maybe the Deputy Secretary for Health and Human Services, inviting in the performance officers, assembling HR leaders, mid-level leaders, senior leaders, and looking at those stats that we've sort of talked about, you know, time to hire, you know, results from an employee survey, you know, what the turnover rate is. And what we've sort of discovered out of this in terms of like a maturity model is that it's not just about the data. It's really about the conversation. It's really around how can we weave the data into the conversation that these senior leaders are having and have that translate into meaningful action plans that can be followed up so that we can begin to be a little bit more predictive, so that we can start to look a little bit more toward what are those things that if we do them will, you know, sort of usher in the results and the outcomes that we're looking for. So by having those types of conversations and looking at time to hire and digging a little bit deeper into that and asking, okay, what are the leading indicators? You know, as I recall, the HR Stat process was sort of born out of, I think, I don't know, it was New York or Chicago police, the municipalities, and, you know, was looking at, you know, potholes, right? You know, so they're sort of counting how many potholes that could be, you know, fixed, or how many broken windows. It's sort of the broken window effect. If you address those kinds of things and, you know, put more lighting in, and, you know, crime will go down, those kinds of things. So it's sort of, how do we look at that as in terms of HR metrics, and what will be the leading indicators that we can use, and then having dialogue where this data is integrated into the intentions and outcomes that the agency wants to achieve, and translating that into meaningful action plans, and then being able to report the next quarterly HR Stat process. So that's just something that comes to mind. I'll turn it over to, I guess, Camille.
Thanks, Jim. So that's very helpful. I think that as a leader, and I am not actually an HR leader. I am an executive officer, so I oversee kind of the entire business side of running one of the institutes at NIH. So it's overseeing all the different business functions. And so for me, I mean, my HR partners are so critical to helping move forward whatever the initiative is we may be working on, be it succession planning or recruitment strategies, or even more importantly, our engagement strategies. What I think is most important, though, is how do we get this information into the hands of the leaders and get their focus on it. The leaders are the people on the front lines. Because the HR folks can do a lot of work, but unless they can get the attention of the people that have the influence and the direct relationship with the staff, we can't be as effective as we want to. And so that's always the challenge, is how do you make sure that you can engage? For me, it's how do you engage the scientists and help them to be taking care of the scientific community as well as the business side of the house. And so how do you translate some of the stuff that Jim was talking to the people that are within these agencies and within the organizations that maybe not business focused, but are the ones that are really taking care of the people of the organization. So I'll turn it over to Aaron if he has anything to add.
So I think what I recall the question being is around how do we have any suggestions or advice of implementing these new strategies or analytics into an organization. And to that end, I think that there's so many tools. Our colleagues have talked about so many of these tools that are out here and so many ways to parse data. Unless you have your stakeholder involvement, it's going to be very challenging in trying to invest and inculcate that into an organizational culture. So I think the first thing, my suggestion would be is to ensure that your stakeholders, your most senior leaders, really have more than a buy-in, but they really want to partner and they really want to take ownership of this business analytics process. I mean, what is it that they see a benefit to, so that way when this does get into the organization and it starts to spread, people are more apt to actually use it and want to put it in form of performance standards and things of that nature, so it actually becomes a part of the culture. But it's challenging if your stakeholders are not involved or don't see the value. So my suggestion is to definitely start with those, and if they're uninterested, then find something along those lines that they're interested in, so that way you're not just bringing something else into the environment that no longer can live because it doesn't have those sponsors who want to support it.
So I think those are all very good points in terms of change management. I think, with all good change management efforts, one of the things that you have to be, a couple of things that you have to be aware of are, you got to find your stakeholders, like Aaron mentioned. You got to know the what's in it for me story. Right, so you should, if you're the leader of the change effort, you should be making sure that you understand kind of that elevator story, what you want people to be talking about, the effort, and when they get in the elevator, and this is what we're talking about, right? So, 2 to 3 minute spiel about what's going on. You have to communicate in multiple different venues, and once you've done that, all different vehicles, do it again, and then again, and again. And then making sure that not only do you identify the what's in it for me, for your stakeholders, but making sure that you're applying good change management principles like finding your early adopters and giving them the tools that they need to take your message out and get that cause adopted. I think, all good change management efforts are undone by the lack of communication, the lack of transparency, and the lack of clarity on what's in it for me. So if you tackle those, I think you're going to be able to bring the analytics component or whatever change initiative you're actually talking about in your agency a lot more effectively.
Thanks, Steve. So for those in our audience, now is another chance for you to get involved here and let us know what you're thinking. So the next question we're going to be asking you is, where do you feel the greatest need for additional analytic capabilities to support your own missions? We're very interested in your perceptions around the technology tools that we've been talking about. So please take a moment and fill out your most desired area: leadership development, morale management, employee engagement, or skill development. And we'll give you a couple seconds to go ahead and select your responses. And then we'll throw those up on the screen and take a look at what you said. All right, just a couple more moments. So here we see our results, and employee engagement is far and away the most popular response, followed by morale management, and lastly, skill development rounding out at the bottom. So Steve, could I ask you to comment on these? Do you feel that these are surprising, or are you expecting such a pronounced response around employee engagement in particular? Are there any value areas that you think that the audience should be more attuned to? Looking for your thoughts here.
So I will say I'm a little bit surprised. Well, not that employee engagement is number one, but morale management is number two. And I think that there's a pretty real reason why that might be the case in today's environment. And I'm not going to get too far into politics, but we're in an area where some of the organizations are shrinking, being shrunk forcibly. And so we're seeing some contractions in terms of job security and ability to achieve mission. So I think that that might attribute to some of the morale management and making sure that people are feeling engaged and essentially loved by the organization when we talk about the federal organization. And I think that that trickles down into state and local as well. This idea of having an employee workforce want to come work for you is becoming more and more important. And so how are we, A, attracting them, but then B, how are we keeping them? And that's where this employee engagement comes to play, right? We all know the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey that's been mentioned in today's conversation. How are we doing stuff? Because you're not going to get any additional funding. You're not going to get awards or bonuses. How are you then going to make sure that you're taking care of your people as an organization and as a leader? And I think that that's becoming more and more critical. We're seeing a huge skill drain. We're only seeing about 2% of the college workforce that's willing to come into the federal government or the government as a whole. 2% is not a lot, and historically it's been about 7 or 8, sometimes 10% of college graduates actually considering coming into work in the public service. So we have to find ways to get over that barrier, and I think the way that we start to address that is through employee engagement and spending some time talking about our mission and getting our employees the buy-in and support that they actually need. So a little bit surprising there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So moving along from that, we have plenty of time now to go around the horn with our panelists. And what we really wanted to make sure we gave our audience, apart from the time that we'll be spending also on the Q&A, was some key takeaways. So one key piece of advice or a couple of key pieces of advice for creating a strong talent pipeline, taking into account all the subjects we've touched on today, such as creating engagement, building technology resources, and also overcoming traditional barriers or morale challenges that may be more relevant today than they have been in the past. So I'd like to ask you, Aaron, have you been thinking of a key takeaway that you could share with the audience? What's a piece of advice that you feel they could really use after this webinar to improve their own operations?
Sure. The best advice I have is to first slow down. Because I think so much of this information, you get excited and you just want to run, you want to use it, you want to get everybody excited about it because you see the benefits of all of these great tools. The second piece of advice I'd have is to make sure that before you run down the hall or talk to a supervisor about how great we could implement something like this is to do your stakeholder engagement piece. That is just the number one way I have seen so many initiatives and ideas and concepts fail is that they have not received the sponsorship that they need from those people who should be blessing off on those things if they're going to live in the environment. So no matter what the tool is, no matter how exciting it is, no matter how many other agencies or organizations are using it successfully, if your stakeholders and your senior leaders are not interested in it or they don't buy off on it, it's just not something that you're going to be able to utilize in your organization. So slow down and get that stakeholder involvement piece. How about you, James?
One of the takeaways that I would offer that I feel is important to remember as human capital leaders is to keep in mind that big data can help enterprise and entities to have a sense of emerging patterns in a ever-changing talent landscape. On the other hand, I would offer that small data what I call small data, helps us to bring in the employee experience into view for supervisors and managers in the organization. For instance, the second question in this FEVS, the survey that we've talked about today, is, I have enough information to do my job well. And the government-wide average for the positive response is just over 71% for 2017. And on the surface, 71 sounds pretty good. Sort of like, we might remember in high school, 70% was considered passing. However, looking at it another way, think about it this way. Imagine you're a supervisor and you have a critical mission to achieve for your organization. And if you've heard that this agency, FEVS, is a helpful management tool, so you decide during the staff meeting that you're going to pick one question you talk about with your staff, and you happen to select, I have enough information to do my job well. And you go around the table, and maybe you have 10 direct reports, and you ask the question, do you have enough information to do your job well? And the first 7 people say yes, which is 70%. And then the next 1 or 2 or 3, says, no, I don't, or, I'm not really sure, or definitely I don't. So here's the managerial question. As a manager, given the challenges that you have to accomplish your mission, can you afford to have 1, 2, or 3 people sidelined by not having enough information to do your job well? So it somehow changes this 70% thing into, a real person sitting there, and having a conversation perhaps with a supervisor, and what can that team sort of do going forward? So I think that's been one of the discoveries, I'll just add a second sort of takeaway, is that the FEVS and some of these other larger activities that we have can get at a framework for the conditions of engagement. But just as it's been mentioned before, it's really that engagement experience and the culture that's within the organization as to how employees can sort of come forward and share their experience. And just to cap off, one of the courses that we've developed in-house at HHS that's really been taking really off is what's called the POWER course, and it stands for Positive Oriented Work Experience Redesign. And it's a very short course, 90 minutes. It's offered for free. We can give it out to other agencies if there's interest. And really what it does is it zooms in on what is the employee's direct work experience and how can they imagine having a more positive work experience, and it sets up some dialogue to talk with the supervisor about bringing that forward. So I'll leave it at that. Who's next up? Is it Camille?
Hi, thanks, Jim, very much. So to build on what everybody is saying, and when I think about key pieces of advice, a couple things. Based on the poll, engagement equals increased morale, and increased morale equals engagement. So, that is not very surprising when you see those two, but the increased engagement is so critical. And so I think that's what's most important. And someone talked about the senior leaders needing to buy in. The senior leaders must buy in because it really starts at the top as far as the culture you are able to create and what the leaders all through the organization will be empowered to do. But the leaders need to be thinking about on a daily basis, how do they create and how do they sustain a culture where employees can flourish, where they have the tools and resources they need, innovation and creativity are rewarded, and there is also standards and accountability. So especially in federal government, leaders can be very shy about dealing with some of the employee relations problems. And mediocrity cannot be acceptable, and there has to be consequences for poor performance. And having those two principles as part of your culture is going to help increase morale, and it's going to help increase engagement as well. And so just one other thing I thought I could bring up. So for instance, at NIDDK, especially because we don't have a lot of resources, but we want to take care of the people of the organization, together with my staff, I have created lots of innovative ways to help. So we had a lot of employees that were coming in that were from the Peace Corps, they're from Pathways, they're from many different walks of life that are junior to federal services. And so in talking with them, because I meet with every new employee, I decided that it was worth putting together a developing professional cohort. And it was a group of all the new professionals coming in And we brought them together in an organized way to build that community, to help foster their professional development and leadership skills, to help them learn the distinction between earning and entitlement, and also to make sure that my core values that I talk about translate to their work. Another thing we put in place is a coaching pilot program. So I have staff that have credentials in coaching. And so we put forward this coaching program to help individuals, especially our more junior individuals, clarify their professional development goals, help to build their problem-solving skills, and to become more effective in their roles. Now, I also noticed that I had a lot of new supervisors that were moving into that role. And when you're a new supervisor, you're faced with challenges that probably any leader that's on this webinar knows. They're very similar challenges that you face when you come into a new job and supervise a group. So again, I wanted to put in place a new supervisor community of practice where we could build that community, we could create a collaborative forum for them, generate best practices, and also bring in experts in many subject matter areas from across the community to help them build their competency. And last but not least, another thing that I do with my staff 2 or 3 times a year, and that's about 120 people, so sometimes it's subgroups, sometimes it's the whole group, is create administrative workshops. And we create these ourselves in-house with our own time and with our own expertise. And we've done workshops on creating cultural change. We've done workshops on what our core values are and how do you translate them when you're on the front line so they don't just sound like lofty goals that a leader is up in an ivory tower talking about, but they do translate into how you do your work and what the environment is within which you work. We've also done workshops on problem solving, how to be an advocate for your customers, how to make sure something makes business sense, and if it doesn't make business sense, how you can articulate and try to push it so that we can make sure that we are exhausting all options and trying to help our scientists move forward. And we've also had them on leadership and development. We've had world cafes where we bring in the senior leaders across the organization to meet with the junior professionals. So these are just some ideas of novel approaches that any organization can put in place to help with leadership and development, can help engage your staff, can help to build a succession plan at all the different levels. So with that, I will turn it over to whoever is next.
That would be me. This is Steve. So I want to just, no worries, Camille. Thank you very much. This is all a very good conversation. I really appreciate the takeaways. What I've heard through this webinar today is that organizations across the government finally understand that we need to start planning for the future, that we need to be focused in on our skills and our people that we actually need. We need to foster engagement wherever and however possible. We need to deal with the fact that technology is changing our jobs by the minute. We're seeing new occupations arise that were never there, new skills needed that we've never needed. It really touches something that Cornerstone did with a study with the Institute for the Future, where we actually looked at some of the skills that folks are going to need to move into the future. And I think it's really related to that. And I'll just talk to them 5 skills that they must master today. We didn't talk about this in the webinar, but I do want to get this in here because I believe it makes sense with everything that we're talking about. The first skill that I think that we need to be enabling our people on is make sense of complex systems, right? So everything is connected and the connections are growing minute by minute, right? So things are connecting, making sure that people understand those complex systems and how they operate. I think being aware of yourself and your brand, make yourself known across your organization, things that you can do to make yourself known within your organization and your occupation and your profession. Helping our individuals befriend the machines. Technology is coming, like it or not, and that's going to have an impact on the way we do work. So be it at the forefront and make sure that you understand how that's going to impact your work. I think another skill was keep it going, right? So this idea of personal resilience, we heard that morale was an issue and maintaining that morale, making sure that we're giving our folks the tools that they need to build that personal resilience that they need in order to move forward. They're going to get hit with a lot of change. They're going to be bringing in artificial intelligence, data analytics. We need that social intelligence, that emotional intelligence and empathy on the job, and we need to care and nurture for that in the actual workforce. And then finally, the last recommendation is things to do to build your tribe. And what I mean by that is network, right? It's build your network, build your brand, make sure that you're connecting, make sure that you're staying relevant with the things that you're doing, and build your tribe. I thought that was a really good study, and I thought it was relevant to this conversation, and I wanted to make sure that you guys had heard that, at least initially. But it was done by Institute for the Future, if you're interested in it. Andrew, I'm going to toss it back to you for, I think, Q&A, correct? Andrew?
Sorry, mute there. But yes, everybody who's on the call today, thank you so much for submitting questions. Let's get started and just right off the bat answer one particular question for you, Camille, and that is, how do I get the FEVS tool that you had mentioned previously in our discussion?
Sure, Andrew. So right now, if you go to the OMB site, that's max.gov, our tool is there, and you have to be a federal agency in order to access it. But I would say that if one of the members of the audience wants to learn more about the tool, I mean, we have actually met with the state of Pennsylvania because they heard about our tool through the Federal News Radio, and they were very interested, and so they were learning about what we did with it and trying to create something themselves based off of it. So if you're not a federal employee where you can go to max.gov, you can always email me, camille.hoover@nih.gov, and I would be able to help you.
Thanks, Camille. So the next question that we see here is, jobs for life seem to be a thing of the past in today's world. How can agencies prepare to address their employees' skill needs in the future? So, James, if you wouldn't mind answering this, and then you could pass it to Aaron maybe, and we'll hear from both of you on this one.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Absolutely. So the question is, jobs for life seem to be a thing of the past in today's world. How can agencies prepare to address their employees' skill needs in the future? I'm assuming giving them the skills they need to create a career for life and advance through a whole continuum there.
Well, I think one way is to, attend sessions like we have here today. I think it was Steve that was talking about some of these skills. I think the, making sense of complex systems. I think that's a critical skill for anyone in any type of work that they're involved with. Knowing your brand, help to befriend the machine, keep it going and building your tribe. I mean, I think those 5 areas, and maybe I'm taking a little bit of a cop out here and not answering it from, an HHS perspective, but I think that just really thinking about what is necessary, going forward. The book, the title or the author escapes me, but, what got you here won't get you there. And I think one of the first real skills is around, an awareness of, sort of what is your ideal self, looking at, the strength finder work, around where your strengths are and what it is that you can really make for a keen contribution to your organization and fulfill your own, career aspirations. So I think that, maybe just opening up to this idea that being more aware of where you are and what is needed going forward, and then being able to be, bold and confident and, strong around taking action to make that shift. That's what I would offer. Camille?
Andrew, I thought you had someone else lined up you wanted to ask this question to.
That's fine, Camille. If you want to answer that too, please go right ahead and then just pass it on to Aaron. Well, great to hear all of your perspectives.
Sure. So when it says jobs for life seems to be a thing of the past, I assume that means that we don't see our workforce starting in one career and staying in it for a long term, that people nowadays are moving around and wanting to have different opportunities. So when I think about NIDDK and some of the things we do, when we bring in our junior staff, we don't bring them in with the expectation that they will be in that job forever. We teach them the skills and ability to be competent at what they're doing, but within 2 to 3 years, we assume that we will have been stretching them and giving them projects that are pushing them beyond their current competencies and helping them explore different areas that they're curious about and maybe where they could shine. And through that, you're able to help people to move around so that if there are gaps or you have a loss, especially in the current environment where there have been less staff in certain areas, you're able to move people around and consider it an opportunity where they can learn new skills that will be transferable and helpful to the organization and to their learning and growth. So we do a lot of that to try to make sure we're taking care of the people of the organization and also getting the best value out of all of the skills they really have to offer that they might not do in their current job.
All right, and Aaron, if you wouldn't mind adding your perspective, that'd be great.
Sure. The only thing I would add to what's been said is that trying some non-traditional learning development opportunities like your brown bag series, you can bring those to life a little bit more and have those to be more interactive and really targeted selection for topics so that way people can really start to think more about non-traditional career choices so they don't get stuck in a particular job series very long, so they can move along and do some other things if they're able to go to some trainings and learn more about those topics. And then I think to couple with that is to doing some internal details, which I don't see a lot of anymore, and I think that's a great opportunity as well for people to internally develop themselves within the organization and learn more about different business lines and business sectors within their agency, so that way they're able to translate and move within the agency to different business sectors without having to leave the organization and without having to stay in a job for life.
Thanks, Aaron. And if you wouldn't mind answering one more question, it's all we have time for here. How have you successfully developed internal employees for advancement versus recruiting from the outside? And if you just wouldn't mind answering that, then we'll give our closing remarks.
One of the greatest tools I think that we have internally is to develop some internal internship-like programs. That's one thing that we've done really successfully, and they're not your traditional internships where students just come for the summer, but more like apprenticeships where newer employees come into a role and function, and then after 6 months they rotate to another, then after 6 months they rotate to another. So they're really able to build skill sets for an entire organizational operation versus one particular mini division.
So this is Steve. Let me go ahead, Camille, sorry.
Well, I was just going to add a couple other things that can help to build your internal workforce. And I know that we have put in place a formal mentoring program, and we encourage people at all levels of their careers not only to have mentors, but now we've tried to formalize a program to really make sure that they're doing that and that they get the benefits that a mentor can provide in helping you as you go through your career journey. And we've also put in place some shadowing opportunities for staff so that they are able to shadow different leaders and learn what other walks in life they might be interested in, but also just in other functional areas so that they can dip their toes in the water and potentially learn about an area they'd like to expand their competency in as well. So I'll turn it back to you, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, picking up on some of the things that you two mentioned, Aaron and Camille, I think the thing it doesn't always have to equate to spending money in order to develop you, right? So at IRS, for example, what we did was this thing called geographic leadership communities, where we identified people that were staff, that were employees of IRS, gave them the opportunities to be an expert in something. People want to learn from each other and they want to collaborate. Enabling that to happen, whether it's through mentoring, shadowing, or even just being an instructor for a specific topic. Everybody has special skills. Finding those out and enhancing them and allowing them to share them is a really powerful community builder and an engagement builder. So just don't think that developing your folks means spending gobs of money on them in terms of training and development, online content, any of that stuff. You can be creative. It's just finding the way to start it and to deliver it and be successful at it. So all good stuff. You know, this is a great conversation. I'm really excited to see the results. And Andrew, why don't you take us out and tell us what's going to happen next, or how do they get the report and that kind of stuff?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to take a moment just to thank the audience and thank our panelists. You guys did an amazing job getting through this content, and I think we all got a lot of really good takeaways that we can put to use. So if we weren't able to get to your questions today that you submitted, we'll be in touch shortly to continue the conversation. Following the webinar, we'd love to hear your feedback, so please participate in a very short survey to share any comments or suggested topics that you'd like us to discuss on future webinars. And to let you know about the content, this presentation will soon be available for on-demand viewing. Everybody who has attended will receive the information to view on demand shortly, so please do keep an eye out for that. Please also take a moment to grab your free copy of the full report, which is currently available in your consoles, as well as live on the HCMG website, which you'll see the URL for here within our resources page. So do please check that out. It's got a lot of insights that we didn't get a chance to discuss. On behalf of HCMG and Cornerstone, I want to thank all of you for your time today and wish you the very best. Thank you.